When I was 6, I kept saying I want to be a doctor, like my parents, and had the kids in Africa. And that sort of impression of intransigent inequality really, I think, confirmed my desire and my plan to go into international development.
How do we integrate that new economy with an aging economy and the caring economy as well?
Yeah.
So I have our work really cut out over the next 10 to 15, maybe 20 years. Hello, my name is Siddharth Chatterjee, the UN Resident Coordinator in China, and I welcome you to Delivering as One, a UN in China conversation. In this podcast, we highlight the heads of UN agencies in China who shape our diversity, discover their motivations, find out their work here on the ground. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Beate Trankmann, Resident Representative of the United Nations Development Programme in China. Ms. Trankmann, a German national, joined the United Nations in China in 2019. Beate, welcome to Delivering as One.
Thank you, Sid, for having me here today. And what better way to end the year than doing this podcast and passing a bit of a retrospective on 2021 and looking ahead to 2022.
Fantastic indeed. So, Beate, let's get started. Tell us about your early life, your education, and your work. Something about your growing up, your studies, and your early career.
Yeah, so as you said, I'm a German national. I was born actually in West Berlin, divided Germany at the time. My dad is originally from the East. My mom is from northern part of Germany. In the divided Germany, to get from West Berlin to Western Germany, to the north where my mom was from, you had to travel through the former German Democratic Republic, which for my dad always was a bit of a problem because he was registered with the authorities. He could only fly. And so when I was 2, we moved to northern Germany, and I grew up actually in the outskirts of Hamburg with my parents and 3 siblings, 2 brothers, 1 sister. And so my parents are both children of war. My dad was born in 1928, my mom in 1937. It was actually really my mom who brought me to development, because she had known scarcity and hunger, and she hated it when we played with food, and always sort of told us, eat up, because there are kids in Africa that have nothing to eat. And I thought that was outrageous. I couldn't understand how the world could be so unjust and divided between haves and have-nots. So when I was 6, my usual answer to the question of what do you want to become when you grow up, I kept saying I want to be a doctor, like my parents, both are medical doctors, and had the kids in Africa. And so this was almost a prediction of my later life. So then I studied actually in different places, Hamburg, in France, and in Taipei. I did my first year of China studies, modern China studies, in Paris at the time. Then moved to Taipei for language training. And so I've been actually connected to China for quite some time, to the language, the culture, the history. And as part of my studies, or after that 1 year abroad language training in Taipei, I traveled in mainland China and around Southeast Asia. That was in 1993. China, of course, was a very different place at the time. But one thing that really marked me from that trip was what I saw in Indonesia and in Jakarta, because their poverty was so palpable. You had literally the slums in the city center right next to the skyscrapers. And that sort of impression of intransigent inequality really, I think, confirmed my desire and my plan to go into international development. So coming back, I continued my China studies, did a master's in political science, And then after my master's, I worked in Brussels for a while for a member of European Parliament and also for a think tank, the European Institute for Asian Studies. And from there, I actually moved to the UN as a junior professional officer funded by Germany and have had stints all around Asia Pacific. So I'm really actually an Asia person. I worked in China, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, then Indonesia, where I was the country director, then Mongolia as resident coordinator and resident representative before coming here. I think looking at my career, it was really a dream come true, having the honor and the privilege to serve the United Nations, because for me, that is an opportunity to make whatever small contribution I can have to making the world a better place. And I'm literally thankful every day for that opportunity. It still inspires me, it motivates me and keeps me on my toes. So
fantastic. How fascinating, Beate. I think many people who would probably be listening to this would get such a perspective on, where you've come from. And, when you said you're a child of war, indeed, we saw the end of the First World War in 1918. And then, little did we know we will see a Second World War. The world has seen. So I think, I suppose your circumstances really shaped you. So fascinating. So your early career then, you eventually came to work in the UN in China and the umbilical cord with China got kind of connected a long time ago. So tell us about your coming to China and more about it and your feelings about it.
So indeed, this posting now is my second posting, and I worked in China in the end 90s, early 2000s, also with UNDP as a program officer. And I was in charge of HIV/AIDS prevention and control. And I think back then, China was already opening up. And it was very clearly a very dynamic country. This was the time when China was negotiating WTO accession. China was also, during that time while I was there, I left in mid-2002, awarded the Beijing Summer Olympic Games, and there were celebrations on the streets. I remember everybody sort of flogging out onto the streets, in Chang'an-Tie and Tiananmen Square, and celebrating that China had been awarded the Olympics. But then at the same time, I think you didn't have to go very far outside Beijing, and this is where it's different to now, to find abject poverty and absolute poverty. 60, 70, 80 kilometers, you would find farmers who had a very hard time surviving and were literally irking out the soil that was sort of, too dry, water levels falling, and so on. I think, if you look, for example, at Henan, which was the epicenter of the HIV/AIDS epidemic at the time, it was very clear that HIV was a poverty disease. Farmers were donating blood to improve their incomes and make ends meet at the end of the months. And they got infected by non-sterilized equipment, needles. And I think this, to me, is completely unthinkable in nowadays China, and in a way shows how far China has come in the last 20 years, let alone in the last 40 years. And I feel, very, again, privileged that I've been able to witness that sort of historic transformation that China has gone through over the years.
Wow. So what does UNDP do to support the people of China and the country's priorities and the UN family at large?
UNDP has been here in China for 40 years. We opened our offices in 1979. And I think our work here has evolved quite dramatically, mirroring actually the transitions that China has gone through over the last 40 years. So in the early days, we were all about, supporting poverty reduction, working on providing trainings, technology transfers, in particular in the agricultural sector. It was actually UNDP, few people noticed, that brought broccoli to China in the 1980s. And that was a way of diversifying, vegetables that are available at the market, enhance nutritional intake, but also enhancing income for Chinese farmers. We were also, I think, one of the ones bringing in the first computers into China and working actually with officials on using IT for development planning. So we trained them on data processing technologies, etc. And then I think with the MDGs in 2000, the focus shifted a bit more to protecting the environment and also energy, renewable energy, and complementing the poverty work that we were doing with those type of approaches. We were, for example, as UNDP, involved in advising the development of the 12th five-year plan to broaden the definitions of development progress and include social aspects, but also environmental aspects. Another example is a program that we had on incandescent lights, where we basically brought energy-saving lamps to China and changed the manufacturing sector for lighting towards energy-efficient LED lamps to be used in public spaces. And that led to the reduction of CO2 emissions of 4.4 million tons. And then since the SDGs came around in 2015, I think we've been very focused on now more providing policy advisory services, so at the upstream and not so much the downstream implementation, to support China in realizing the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. And that includes working, for example, with local authorities on advising them to align their development plans with the SDGs, on supporting progress tracking for the SDGs. In 2016, we had a very interesting program actually with Baidu to look at real-time poverty measuring and using big data and indicators that you can track with the help of big data, such as doing lightning maps and looking at pipe water and access to roads, to really have a real-time understanding of where the remaining pockets of poverty are. So yes, I mean, that's a bit of the evolution that UNDP has seen over the last 40 years, which, as I said, mirror the development that China has witnessed and going along supporting China in addressing emerging development challenges.
Great. And, UNDP remains a critical partner of the UN cooperation framework with China from 2021 to 2025. So in that regard, Beate, could you provide some insight on the key beneficiaries of your organization here in China?
Yeah, so UNDP, I think, as everywhere, as the primary development agency of the United Nations system, we really focus on making sure that development includes everyone and benefits everyone, and ensuring that really we're not leaving anyone behind, which is at the core, of course, of the SDGs. So as part of that, I think we work across a fairly wide array of stakeholders, and those include the poor, the youth, the elderly, but also women and migrant workers, people living with HIV/AIDS. And I think we particularly focus on people who are affected by multidimensional poverty and try and identify these groups by using measures beyond income, looking at access to quality education, access to quality health, but also now with the pandemic, looking very much at the vulnerable groups that are at risk of sliding back into poverty. And I think as part of that, women, for example, are a key group because they actually represent several groups in one, right? Women make up the majority of the elderly population. They make up the majority of rural population. So we're working with them, for example, we're working on women's entrepreneurship to increase the resilience of women to shocks. But we're also working, for example, with migrant workers, with workers in general as part of the sort of fourth industrial revolution and the economic transformation that China is undergoing, reskilling them to make sure, that they can survive in the digital economy. We're working with sort of what we call aging entrepreneurs to make them internet savvy so that they can access markets, sell their produce. Also in, the lockdown, that became a very important coping strategy. So fairly wide array of people, but I think the idea behind it is always inclusion and leaving no one behind.
Great. And I think you made a very pertinent point. I think one of the key aspects of China's demographic transition is actually aging. It's China, Europe, the US, whereas, you're seeing an African continent where the median age is 18,
Absolutely.
Parts of South Asia. So I think then how do we integrate that new economy with an aging economy and the caring economy as well?
Yeah.
So I think we have our work really cut out over the next 10 to 15, maybe 20 years in that regard. Very thoughtful. Thank you for that. Let's go on to some of the remaining development challenges that you see in China in the coming years and how your organization as part of the UN in China will assist China, particularly with the focus on what our Secretary General often reminds us is the North Star, the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah, so development is always work in progress anyway. And there are obviously remaining challenges in China as there are around the world. And I think we take the two North Stars, so to speak. One is, of course, the SDGs, and our work here is also very much informed by China's 14th five-year plan and the development priorities that China has set out in this next stage of its development journey. And of course, China's development story is a huge story of success. China has lifted 770 million people out of poverty over the last 4+ decades. That's about 3/4 of all people around the world having been lifted out of poverty. It is also one of only a handful of countries that has actually moved from low levels of human development to high levels of human development on UNDP's Human Development Index since we started measuring this in the 1990s. But I think this success has also come with, to some extent, widening divides. If you look at, for example, the growth in income of the bottom 40% over the last 20 years is half the rate of the top 1%. In terms of, if you compare urban-rural disposable incomes, urban disposable incomes are 2.6 times higher than rural disposable incomes. And you also have still 600 million people in China living on about 1,000 renminbi per month, slightly over 1,000 renminbi per month, which is, of course, an amount that will afford you very different amounts depending on where you live, whether in the east or the west, coastal regions, central regions. And I think growth has also come at the expense of the environment. China has lost 60% of its coastal wetlands since the 1950s until the turn of the millennium, and 50% of the mangrove areas. So very important ecosystems that are also protecting against the effects of climate change. Household waste, for example, talking about consumption, right, has increased sevenfold between 1979 and 2013. So I think our work nowadays is really about, as I said before, addressing the new frontiers in China's development today and the challenges that, I think, if you want to boil it down to one question, to me it's really about how can we ensure that we continue advancing human well-being for all while remaining within the planetary and the ecological boundaries. And I think this is not only important for China and its people. I mean, we've seen the effects, for example, that pollution has had on people's healths. But it's also very important to determine whether us as an international community, we are able to meet the SDGs and avert the worst effects of climate change. China is immensely important for that. It's the second biggest economy in the world. It constitutes roughly 1/5 of the world's population. It's also the biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in absolute terms because of the size of its economy. So in that context, I think our focus as UNDP is really very much on supporting China's transition to a low carbon and eventually a net zero economy. And in doing so, finding also innovative ways of financing that transition, mobilizing the capital that we need, not only from government, but also from private sector, from all of society, while ensuring at the same time that we're protecting the most vulnerable populations during these times of transformation. And so to lift that a little bit out of the abstract, one thing that we're doing is, for example, working on innovative financing means for the SDGs. So we've developed as UNDP, together with the regulators, with the private sector, with People's Bank of China and others, what we call SDG impact practice standards for bonds and private equity. We've developed a taxonomy that helps identify SDG investment opportunities for the markets and for private sector. And all of this is building on the good work that China is already doing in green finance and emission trading systems, etc. So it's all about how can we actually direct, if you like, finance towards protecting the climate and nature rather than undermining both. Yeah. And we also work with China, in its role as an international development cooperation partner to make sure that we leverage China's contributions to international development towards the SDG and towards meeting the Paris Climate Agreement. So working on South-South cooperation and trilateral cooperation, instilling best international practice, norms, standards such as ESG principles, environment, social and governance principles, but also sharing China's experience overseas. So these are a few of the examples of the work we're doing nowadays. But China is a fascinating place to work because the thinking here is really very, very advanced and it's really at the cutting edge of development.
Right. And it's interesting that you point out that the human development indicators in the 90s were pretty low, and the speed with which it has risen, I think again becomes a good example of how other countries, particularly in the developing world, which are still grappling with low human development indicators, can actually lift them up and lift them up much faster, because now we have access to that kind of technology and innovation and big data to help make that happen. And I think what COVID reminded us is that not only about our own fragility, but our ability to adapt and bring in more internet technology so that children can continue to go to school. It laid bare many of those things. It's like the Secretary General told us at the RC meeting this time. The major challenges that the world is confronted with, the COVID crisis itself, the climate crisis, and then we have a crisis of inequality, which is, widening at every level, whether it's gender or it's urban to rural or income inequality. It's just the whole range. So yes, I think we have our work cut out both in China and with China, with the rest of the developing world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, China's work, and this is also something that we're looking increasingly into, how China can support the international fight against climate change with all the technology that it has, right? Being sort of having 1/3 of installed wind power capacity, 25% of solar power capacity, and with the commitment of the presidency that China will, going forward, not invest into coal power plants overseas. So leveraging these type of partnerships indeed with China to address the critical challenges of our time is, I think, really what the UN here needs to be about under your leadership. And that's, of course, something that you're looking into very closely also as part of the Africa-China partnerships.
I remember the words of John Kerry when he came to Shanghai. He said that the new green economy or the climate economy will rival the industrial revolution. I think the potential is huge. And, if we can really shape that agenda collectively with the government of China and globally as the UN, I think we will be doing great service to humanity. I think the next 10 years and will be
Absolutely,
quite defining.
and I think this is also an argument that we increasingly have to put forward as the UN, because the green energy economy already creates more jobs than oil and gas. True. Right? The projections are by 2050 there will be 42 million new jobs coming online in green energy. And making the argument that this is actually not a cost, but it's an investment into our future, and it makes business sense to do it. For all intents and purposes, even if you look at the survival of supply chains and business. And I think that is really where we sort of, with the combined expertise of the UN, can help advance approaches and thinking and application of how we actually do that and how we transform our economies globally.
Wow, so this is fascinating. So let's look at a day in your life, Beate. What does a day look like from the time you wake up to the time you go to bed? If you go to bed at all, because I know that you work very, very late.
Yes, I do. But it's always too much work to fit it into a normal work day. But, for me, it's positive stress. It's inspiring stress, right? It's a mission. But yes, how does a day look like? I feel like I'm always on the run. It's always very fast paced, running from sort of one event and one meeting to another, to things that I need to do. But usually my day starts with a proper coffee, very important, because I'm not a morning person, so can't function without a coffee. And then usually on the way to work in the car, after I get picked up, I kind of scan emails quickly and look at what's bubbling, what do I need to sort of address. Schedules obviously always vary, but I think there's always sort of events, public speaking engagement, outreach events, representational functions that I have in a normal day, and then combined with meetings with the team, to guide, to discuss, to strategize. In an ideal day, I would have a little bit of time to also put on my thinking caps, read, look at speeches, at briefing notes, reports that I want to do and refine my thinking. After office, twice a week, I do ballet training.
Oh, fantastic.
So that's my lifeline to sanity
and fitness.
And literally keeps me in balance. And then oftentimes, yes, with New York time difference, in the evening there will be the conference calls and coordination meetings with New York. But I do try and balance and create my island. Day does tend to be long, but within a day find a moment to recharge so that I can go into the second round, and ballet is certainly part of it.
Fantastic. I just hope a lot of the listeners who are listening in now will also know that not only do you do ballet for exercise, but you're quite a formidable ballet dancer. So,
well, I'm not at professional level. I've done it pretty much all my life, and I started when I was 6 years old, actually. But yeah, I love it, and it is very, very good training. It helps your coordination, but it also helps your mental focus, because ballet is about defying gravity, basically.
Indeed.
And it looks so easy, but it's so hard. And if you don't focus, you can't do it. So really, when I do that, I have to shut out everything else, and it's a very good discipline for me. No, I mean, I would imagine that, and if I remember in history, we saw that, the former Soviet Union and Germany used to produce, which is, the combined efforts of the former East and West Germany, some of the finest ballet dancers, that we saw in the global theater and landscape. So that's very fascinating. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, Beate, we are now getting to the part where we've all committed to delivering as one the clarion call made by the UN Secretary General as part of his UN reforms and what it means. What does delivering as one mean to you?
I think in one word, it's teamwork. And it's teamwork within agencies. And I think I'm very blessed with my team here. I have an absolutely formidable team. They're so committed and they're so creative, and they never stop ask how can sort of UNDP be more relevant? What else do we need to do? Where are the opportunities so that we really can drive the critical agendas? So it's within teams, but it's also across the entire UN team. And I think we have a very good UN country team here, a very cohesive team. People, work well with each other under your leadership with different skills. We get along. And I think that is very very important because the SDGs are such a comprehensive and inseparable agenda that it really takes all hands on deck and all the expertise of all agencies to deliver at the quality and the speed that is required to push the envelope. And I think this is really, at the end of the day, what UN reform is all about. It is about making the whole bigger than the sum of its part and creating economies of scale. So I think the goal is really for everyone to work together, contributing complementary skill sets, expertise and mandates. And I think the UN reform idea very well enunciates that, and I feel we're practicing it quite well here in this country team in China.
Yeah. And you know, I have to take this opportunity to also thank UNDP, Beate, and you in particular for the leadership you're providing, not only to the cooperation framework, but to a very critical part of our thematic area, which is on the area of partnerships, which is going to be what will define our work both in China through the cooperation framework, but with China in terms of our South-South work. You've been a resident coordinator, Beate, so you were very seasoned having been in that role in Mongolia. In your view, what makes an ideal resident coordinator?
As a resident coordinator, you have to be a bit everywhere, right? There is a lot of multitasking involved and covering complex agenda. But at the same time, you have to be approachable, right? Because you have to know, where is the fortes of your country team. You have to be able to, and I was smiling when you used the word sweet spot, because that's always something that I used when I was describing my role in Mongolia. I think, as a resident coordinator, you're really being called upon with your office to deliver the intelligence and the analytics to identify the sweet spots where the UN team actually needs to come together to deliver on an agenda that cannot be delivered by agency-specific mandates, right? And creating these opportunities and creating the economies of scale and the complementarity. So that's, I think, one very important part of the job. And the other part is obviously that the resident coordinator is the public face of the UN, right? She speaks for the UN. And I think communications in the UN sometimes is actually quite challenging, right? Because we're dealing with very complex, very abstract issues. And there is this tendency in the UN of, reverting to jargon no one understands. I sometimes sort of call it the UN alphabet soup, right? The UN resident coordinator as the chief communicator of the UN, I think, has to be able to basically tell the story, the work of the UN and the relevance of the UN, and getting the point across to different audiences and different stakeholderships, why this is important, so that we mobilize support. Because in order to really realize the SDGs by 2030, we need all hands on deck, right? It's an all of society agenda. It's government, it's business, it's civil society, it's individuals. And relaying that message that all of us have to change, and we have to constantly sort of ask that question, how are we shifting directions so that we can actually protect the planet and reduce inequality, take everyone with us as part of the development journeys in countries that we are supporting as UN teams, I think is a very important role that the resident coordinator has. And I feel you're doing that quite well, actually, being out there talking, engaging with very different stakeholderships. So.
Well, I don't think any resident coordinator will succeed without the full and complete support of the leadership of the agency's funds and programs. And on that count, once again, Beate, let me commend you for that. Amina Mohammed, our Deputy Secretary General, says, people, planet and prosperity has to be kept, on track. Well, thank you very, very much, Beate, and let me take this opportunity to wish you, your family, UNDP, all your loved ones a very, very happy New Year.
Thank you so much. Sid, same to you and family, and very much look forward to another exciting year under your leadership in 2022.
Thank you, Beate. Thank you very much, Beate, once again for sharing your story and sharing your time with us today. If you would like to learn more, visit china.un.org or follow the UN in China on our Twitter handle. Join us next time for another installment of Delivering as One, a UN in China conversation.